So today as we jump in, we're going to be in John chapter 6. Out of the whole book of John, this one's going to be one that we're going to split this chapter into two pieces. It's a very long chapter, and there is so much depth in this chapter. I don't want to run through it and miss something. So there are going to be stories that you guys have heard before, more than likely. If you've been in church for any period of time, or even outside of church, you've probably heard some of these stories. But what I want to do today is try to bring a little bit of more clarity to it. I'm going to try to share a few more details that aren't necessarily in the passage, but to bring some contextual aspects to it, to bring it together, maybe make it come to life a little bit more in your life. And then you guys can figure out how you bring application out of this and put that application into your life as we move forward. So we're going to be in John chapter 6. So if you follow along, please grab your Bibles, use the YouVersion Bible app. We're currently live there if you use that, so you can follow along there. But we're going to jump right in because there's a lot here, and it's going to be so good. So it jumps in and it starts, John chapter 1. It says, sometime after this. So John is just saying, hey, look, we've talked about these things, but there was a little bit of time in between. They had traveled some distance, traveled north some distance between what happened in John 5 and then what he's writing down here in John 6. So he says, sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. This is the Sea of Tiberias. So one of the things to know is Tiberias would have been one of the Roman rulers. So very likely they had gone around in that area, and Rome had started to rename certain things in the area. And this was one of those things. So John just writes it down and say, hey, this is what it was known as. Oh yeah, by the way, it was also known as this. So it's kind of like the Gulf of Mexico and the Gulf of America. Just to throw that out there, like it's just these different things, like just different names for the same thing. That's what I'm trying to bring up. That wasn't political, okay? I don't try to get political up here, but just the reality. That's where we are today. That's what we hear. This is bringing that in. That's what it's like. And it says this, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Jeff talked about that last week, the healing at Bethesda. And what's happening here is there's this great group of people now that are following Jesus because they've watched what he's done. Then verse 3, it says, then Jesus went up on the mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. So John does a really great job of bringing in the area. He wants us to know where things are happening, and he does a great job of telling us when things are happening. So this is right before Passover. People are coming in. There will be great multitudes of people, to use a biblical term, a great number of people will be coming into town for this festival. So there will be a ton of people in this area traveling along to see what has been taking place. So there's all of these people who have just started to follow Jesus because of things that he had done, signs that he had done, miracles that he had done. And I wonder sometimes if there's a difference between following Jesus and being a disciple of Jesus. Do you think, in your mind, when you think about that, do you think there's a difference? When you hear about people who follow Jesus, do you think following him and being a disciple of his is different? Because when I read through this passage, there seems to be a distinction that John is making. There's all of these people that are following him, but yet he goes to the mountainside with his disciples. There seems to be a difference between being a disciple and being a follower. And I think I see this today. There are people that you might be able to talk to, and they would say things like, yeah, I know of him. I know him. When in reality, they don't really know him. They just know about him. And I feel like that's a little bit of what's going on right here. There's this great multitude of people who are now following Jesus because they saw him do things. They watched him heal a man. So now they're just tracking with him, maybe just trying to get a healing. So that's sort of what's happening here. And just to kind of keep that context, keep that in mind, I do believe genuinely there's a difference between just following somebody and really being in relationship with them. Think about your social media today. I was with my daughter this past week, and we were talking about like people that we follow on different social media platforms, YouTube specifically. And she said, I have a personal relationship with about 50% of the people that I follow. And I'm like, well, that's probably pretty good, because I think most people who have all these followers or that are following a lot of people have very few that they actually have personal relationship with. So if we can bring that context into this, we don't want to just be following Jesus. We want to be in a personal relationship with Jesus. So that's what I want you to be focused on as we continue to walk through the rest of this chapter. So the Passover was coming. Jesus had gone aside to sit aside with his disciples on the mountainside. Verse 5, it says this: when Jesus looked up, a great crowd coming toward him, he saw this great crowd coming toward him, and he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" Now John adds a little commentary here, and he said he asked this only to test him, because he already knew what he was going to do. And Dawn and I talked about this a little bit this week. We see that Jesus asks questions a lot. He asks a lot of questions. Do you realize he didn't have to? He already knew. He already knows what you're going to do. He already knows how you're going to respond. But yet he wants your input. He wants, again, this is that personal, relational component. So he's asking Philip, and I wondered, why in the world would he have picked Philip to ask this question? Now, there might be lots of reasons why he picked Philip. One of them could have been Philip was from the area. It'd be like me coming to one of you locals here and saying, all right, where can I go buy the best maple donut? And you would be able to tell me. So Philip's from the area. So maybe that's why he asked Philip. Maybe Philip was the one that was closest by. So he's just like, where are we going to find bread for all these people? So there's lots of different reasons. Or maybe Philip is actually having a struggle in his life. Maybe Philip is having a crisis of faith where he's just really struggling to trust that Jesus can indeed do the things he says he can do. And maybe that's why Jesus chose to ask Philip. We're not really given a ton of information there other than he did it to test him. Verse 7, Philip answered him this way. It says, it would take more than a half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one of them to have just a bite. Some of your scriptures might say 200 denarii, which is like, it's about 3/4 of a year's wages, a half a year to 3/4 of a year for an average person's wages, just for everybody in that crowd to have a bite. It talks about 5,000 men, which is what we'll talk about, but more than likely there would have been women and there would have been children as well. So we're talking about 10,000 to 15,000 people here in this crowd that's now coming forward to see Jesus. And then there's another disciple. His name is Andrew. He's Simon Peter's brother. He spoke up and he said, here's a little boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many? I love this about Andrew. We don't hear a lot about the disciple Andrew. What we hear about Andrew is he's one of the first ones that Jesus talks to. And Andrew runs off and he goes and he finds his brother Simon. And he brings him back to Jesus. What I love about Andrew is a connector. Andrew connects people. Specifically, Andrew connects people to Jesus. I remember when I first got saved and people would be like, well, what character in the scriptures do you kind of find yourself like? I was like, I don't know, maybe Jonah. Like, I feel like I got swallowed by a whale. But the older I got and the more in-depth I became into the scriptures, the more I started to think, you know what, maybe I'm a little bit like Peter. Like I would just be super excitable and I would do things and I would get really juiced and somebody would try to hurt somebody that I love and I would try to hurt them because they tried to hurt somebody that I love, like Peter did when he whapped off that guy's ear. And I thought, maybe I'm like Peter. And then I get a little older and I move into ministry and I'm doing other things. And I'm like, maybe I'm like Paul. Maybe my whole goal is just to introduce people to Jesus and to train and encourage people. And then I read this one and I start to thinking about Andrew. And I'm like, Andrew is a connector of people. And some people have a problem because they look at people like myself or other pastors or celebrity pastors or whatever, and they're like, yeah, but you know what? I'm a Christian, but I'm not a Christian like them. Because I don't get up and I don't talk to people. I don't get up and I don't preach messages. I don't get up and I don't do this or I don't do that. When in reality, maybe God just didn't call you to do that. Maybe God called you to be Andrew and just introduce people to Jesus. You're not called to be up here and preach. I get that. We're not all called to do that. But maybe you're just called to be like Andrew. When I think about Andrew, man, it gets me jacked up because I'm like, if it wasn't for Andrew, then maybe Simon Peter would have never met Jesus. Simon Peter became this guy in the church that wound up being one of the greatest leaders amongst the disciples early on. There's multiple books that he wrote that we read regularly. Simon Peter knows Jesus because Andrew introduced him. Do you have people in your life that know Jesus because you introduced them? And if you don't, do you know people in your life that desperately need Jesus? And is God calling you to be the Andrew in their life to introduce them? It can't be comfortable all the time. As a matter of fact, it probably shouldn't be comfortable any of the time. Doing what God's called you to do can be hard. But don't think you're less because you don't stand here. And please don't think I'm more because I do. Because I'm just doing what God called me to do. And maybe He's called you to be just like Andrew. Do you think that Andrew's any more important to Jesus than Simon Peter? No, he's not. Just had a different job, different expectations. And we all live with that. And I can tell you this. If I was your worship leader, you wouldn't be here. I'm going to just tell you. I know what I sound like when I sing because I really actually love to sing. So I'm called to do something different. Gabby's called to do something different. You're called to do something. What is it? Maybe it should be like Andrew. Just don't look down on people who don't have what you would consider to be these high roles. Because let's just be honest. Jesus is very clear. The first will be last. The first will be last. And please don't put me up on a pedestal. I say that all the time and I genuinely mean it. I'm just a dude. Just like you. Just a dude. And the moment I think I'm anything more than a dude, you should just kick me out of here. I'm being serious when I say it. If I ever put on a role or a face that I'm something more than just a dude, we need to have conversations, and I need to leave. Okay? All right, we move on. I don't know how we got there with Andrew, but I do love Andrew. So it goes on, and Andrew's like, hey, look, there's this boy over here. He has 5 barley loaves. Barley loaves. That would have been nasty flatbread. We see pictures of the loaves and the fish, and we think these big old giant loaves of bread and all that. Guys, that's not what a barley loaf would have been like. It would have been like a pita bread. Little, small. This boy's lunch. Mom didn't send him with 5 great big giant Wonder Bread loaves. He has 5 small barley loaves. Barley for the poor people. They would have been eating barley. Not great grain. And he has 2 fish. And we think of these fish like he brought in 2 giant mahi. He didn't bring in 2 giant mahi. That's not what he had. But we're talking like little sardines. So when we see this and we see these depictions, and it's almost like people are like, well, people won't believe that Jesus could do that with just this. So we'll make everything look just a little bit bigger. It was 10,000 people. No matter what was in that basket, it wasn't going to matter. It had to be a miracle. But just keep that in mind. So they're there, and he's got these little fish and these loaves of bread. And Jesus says, have everybody sit down. It goes on and says, there's plenty of room. There's plenty of grass in this place. They all sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed those to those who were seated, as much as they wanted. And he did the same with the fish. Now, if you go back, you can read the same miracle is in all 4 Gospels. That means it's pretty important. All 4 of the Gospel writers wrote about this one. Mark actually says there was much grass. One of the disciples that wrote it talks about the grass being green, which helps us to know because grass and lots of green grass in this area definitely pinpoints that Passover time frame. Because most of the time, grass was not green. It's kind of like being here in Florida. So they all sat down, nice fluffy grass on the hillside, and it goes on. He says this. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted. So they gathered them, and they filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by what had been eaten. So we're looking at these 2 sardines and 5 flatbreads. And Jesus has multiplied them in such a way that now there are baskets left over. Baskets of food left over. from one small basket, you feed 10,000 people, and now there's stuff left over. Does any of that make sense? Can you wrap your brain around that at all? And the reality is, no, you probably can't. None of us can. This is absolutely miraculous. But what it took was Jesus. And we can look at the young boy who gave his lunch away. We can look at him and go, man, what faith? What faith would for Andrew to even say, hey, there's some fish and bread over here. That in itself is amazing. Why would he even point that out? There's some faith involved there. There's all of these different faith components that we find here. And these are disciples versus followers, okay? I believe genuinely that's the difference between a disciple and a follower. Somebody who just knows about Jesus and somebody who is in an intimate relationship with him. So it goes on. They have all of this bread and they have all that stuff left over. Interestingly enough, they had all that they wanted. They ate all they wanted. That's miraculous in itself. People in this time would not have known what it meant to have a full belly. That would not have been common. Maybe at a wedding feast, they may have been able to get a full belly, but to be able to eat everything that they wanted would have been so rare. We don't really, most of us in the room don't know what that is like anymore, to not have what we need and to have enough food to fill our bellies. But that would have been so unusual back then. So the fact that they were all full tells us a little bit more about why they ultimately do what comes up here in just a few moments. So they gathered up all that bread. It says, after the people saw the signs performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who has come into the world. Jesus knew, this is hilarious. Jesus knew that they intended to come and make him king by force. He withdrew again to the mountain by himself. So Jesus knew that after he had done what he did, that the people wanted them to be the king. And they were going to take him by force and make him be king. The interesting thing here is they recognized Jesus correctly. They recognized Jesus as King Jesus. But what they wanted him to do was out of place, out of time. It didn't make sense. It wasn't what he was supposed to do. He wasn't coming to be this warrior king. He wasn't coming to wipe people out. He was coming to bring people together. And they saw him as king. They saw him correctly. But their behaviors were out of line. And man, every time I read this chapter these last couple of weeks as I've been preparing, I read this and I just think, man, I can be guilty of this. I can see Jesus as king, but my expectations for him are out of line. I see Jesus as king. And then I wonder, God, how are we going to do this? How are we going to grow this church, God? How am I going to see my kids, God? How are we going to do all of these different things? And I get these expectations of him and I put him in the wrong place, when what I need to do is just settle in and recognize he is king. And when I recognize that Jesus is king and I can trust it, then all this other stuff can just fade away. All of these other things that have me so worked up and I'm so worried about, health, freedom, finances, all of the different things that we struggle with. When we recognize that Jesus is king and we don't put our own agendas in place, we can allow some of those things to just fade away. And I think that's the beautiful piece of it. And maybe that's just what we miss. Just allowing Jesus to be king. Just let him be king. And put your own agendas aside. That's what they had. These people had an agenda. They had an agenda. So Jesus withdrew again by himself. Verse 16. It says, when evening came, his disciples went down to the lake where they got into a boat and they set off across the lake to Capernaum. So one of the depictions of this talk about how maybe Jesus had sent them. He sent his disciples down to go to the other side of the lake. By now it was dark and Jesus had not yet shown up. A strong wind was blowing and the water grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 to 4 miles, they saw Jesus appearing or approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. Hello? Yeah, I think maybe it'd be a little scary. But what's happened here is Jesus withdrew he sent his disciples across. They were going to go across the lake. The lake is about 8 miles wide, 13 miles long. This is a pretty decent sized lake. Not a pond, it's a lake. And it sits really low, so when the wind comes across the mountain, they talk about mountains. Many of those are really just like hills. We would call them hills. Well, I guess we're in South Florida. We might call them mountains. Because, like a sand dune is like a mountain around here. But the wind would come over that, and it would reach down and it would hit the lake. And as it came across that lake, it would stir up some nasty storms. So these guys are in the middle of a nasty, nasty storm. They're halfway across the lake. And it would be, to me, that would be scary. I'm sure that's not uncommon for them. They're fishermen. They would have been used to being out in the middle of the lake when the storms came in. But it would be a little scary. Rough waters, small boats, and they're heading across. And they look up, and there they see him. Walking on the water is Jesus. They've seen miracle after miracle already. They've seen him heal people. They saw him turn water into wine. Now they've seen him turn 5 bread loaves and 2 fish into feeding all these people. They've watched all of that. But even still, would it not have been a little uncomfortable to see Jesus walking on the water? That would be uncomfortable to me. But they see him. There he is. He's coming across the water. But he says to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were headed. The piece of this entire passage, the entire section that I wanted to touch on today is right there, and I'm coming back to it, okay? It says, he said, "Do not be afraid." Then they willingly took him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were headed. That's interesting, and I'll be back to that. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realized that only one boat had been there, and that Jesus had not entered that with the disciples, but that they had gone away alone. So they realized there was one boat, the disciples got in it, and they went. Jesus didn't go with them. So they're looking around the area. Where is Jesus? Where is Jesus? He was here. He just fed us. We were all full, but now we're hungry again. To me, it's kind of like eating a lot of sushi. You can eat as much sushi as you want. You can get really full, and 3 hours later, you're hungry. GMO or something. I don't know. But this is what's happened. These people are now, they're hungry. It's the next day. They're hungry again, and they're looking for Jesus. Where did Jesus go? He didn't go with his disciples. And then some boats from across the lake had come over and evidently indicated that Jesus was over there. Verse 24 says, once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into their boats and they went over there to search for Jesus. So they were going back over to find him. Now, what we get into next is going to be for next week. But I'm going back to verse 21. Because this is the difference between a follower and a disciple. Verse 21 says this, then they were willing to take him into the boat. That may not scream at you, but for the last 2 weeks, this has screamed at me. They were willing to take him into the boat. What happens is, people, they want to follow Jesus because they want what he has to offer. And maybe you know people like this. Maybe you have people in your life, they only come around when they want something. We all have those people in our lives. And you might even be able to pinpoint a couple of them in your brain right now. Like, man, when that phone when that text comes, would they please just call me so I don't have to answer? Because these people who just come around when they just want something. That's what followers do. Followers show up when they want something. When they want something from you, they're going to show up. But when the going gets tough, guess what? They're gone. They're not around when you need them. They're followers. Disciples, friends, family, they're around. And what happens right here is unbelievable to me. Because it says so clearly, they willingly brought him into the boat. They were in the middle of a storm. Anybody in the middle of a storm right now? I think most of you are. I've had a lot of conversations recently. Lots of us right in the smack dab in the middle of a storm in our lives right now. But the question is, are you in the middle of a storm and you're trying to fight it on your own? Are you in the middle of the storm and nobody else really knows it? Are you in the middle of the storm and you want to just complain on Facebook? You don't really want answers. And the last person you're reaching out to is God. What's happening here is they willingly brought Jesus into the boat and their storm went away. Instantly. It instantly went away. Now, I don't want to mislead you to think that just because you invite Jesus in the middle of your storm, that it's instantly going to be gone. But I can tell you this, you invite Jesus in the middle of your storm and you no longer have to fight it alone. These guys had been rowing for many, many hours, maybe 6 to 8 hours they had been rowing just to make it 3.5 miles. That means that storm was bad and they weren't making it to the other side. They were in the middle of one of the worst storms they've probably ever seen. And here comes Jesus just walking. And the next thing they do, they snatch him by the hand and drag him in. As a matter of fact, it says they willingly took him in. I wonder if it was almost forcible. Like, here comes Jesus, he can fix this. Get in my boat. Have you ever had to say that? Or have you ever been willing to? Where things are just so rough that you have to ask Jesus into your boat. They did, and everything changed instantly for them. For you, it'll change. Things will change. I just don't know what your battles are. I don't know what your storm is necessarily. But you know what? When we think about the idea that Jesus sent them to the other side, do you think Jesus didn't know the storm was coming? Is it possible that Jesus has sent you right to the middle of your current storm? And if he has, does it make you go, what the heck? Why would you send me to the middle of this storm? Why would you send me right to the middle of all of this chaos? Why would you send me right here, right now, where I have to deal with all of this stuff that I don't want to deal with? It hurts. But if he sends you right to the middle of the storm, it's so that he can show up and he can show off and your life can be forever changed. All you have to do is willingly ask him into your boat. That's it. Willingly ask him in. You know what he'll do? He will gratefully step in and be a part of your life and help you walk through whatever storm you're in. Sometimes our storms are self-made. Believe me. A lot of times we want to blame the enemy. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, well, the devil's got me in a bad spot. Can I just tell you? It probably wasn't the devil, it's your own decision making that's got you in that bad spot. That's a reality. It's your own flesh that's put you in that bad spot. However, regardless of how you got there, Jesus is standing by, ready to step in, ready to help, ready to listen. And all you have to do is say, come on in. Now this morning, I don't know everybody in the room. I know most of you, but I don't know where all of you stand in your relationship with Jesus. Do you find yourself as a follower, as described? Where you've heard of him, you know about him, but you're not really genuinely in a relationship with him. Maybe that's where you stand. Or maybe you're where I was before I met Jesus. Maybe you stand in the spot where you're like, I really don't care. He has no role in my life. I don't care if he exists or not. That's where I stood before I met him. But maybe that's where you are. And if that's where you are, I just want to invite you right now to take a moment to pray and accept Jesus into your boat. Let him come into your life and change everything for you. Because he can and he will. And he's promised to do so. So let's all just bow our heads and pray. And if that's you this morning, if you find yourself as just a follower or somebody who doesn't believe at all, and you want to invite Jesus in, and you want to allow him to be Savior of your life, and you want to bring him into your boat, and just try him out and see what he can do in your life. Let him come into your life. If that's you, we're gonna pray, and this is how I'm going to ask you to just do this. The Bible's very clear. It says in Romans 10:9 and 10 that if you believe and confess that Jesus is Lord, you will be saved. That's inviting him into your boat in the middle of your storm. And it would just go something like this. So if that's you, you can say it in your heart. You can say it now, you can say it later, but I think there's no better time than right now to ask Jesus into your boat. It goes something like this. Lord God, I trust that Jesus came, he lived, he did all of these miracles. Lord, I know that he went to the cross and he died for me. That I could have eternal life, that I could spend eternity with you. And right now I'm begging you to just come into my boat. I need your help. I want to not just be a follower, I want to be in genuine relationship with you. Forgive me for where I've been, for what I've done. And allow me to spend eternity with you in relationship. In Jesus' name, amen.